What we're going to be doing now is we're going to have a panel discussion on missionaries and ministry to foreign residents. And so, as we have now heard early on, the Japanese church has been increasingly having the conversation about, hey, there's a lot of foreign residents who are coming to Japan. This should probably impact our ministry. Many of our churches should think about how we can be more open to ministering to foreign residents or reaching foreign residents. Really grateful for Yoshinaga Sensei kind of setting the stage for us. What we want to do right now is we want to get a sense what missionaries may already be doing, and also what are some of the kind of prevailing missiologies as it relates to ministering to foreign residents. So I've asked a few mission leaders if they'd be willing to be part of this panel, and we're just going to have kind of a casual conversation. I'm going to ask some questions and things, but I'm hoping this will be kind of comfortable sitting around a table. And even though we don't have a table, you guys have tables. And we'll get started. So let me pray for us, and then we'll go from there. Father, thank you so much for this afternoon. Thank you for a good lunch. Thank you for the opportunity to be with brothers and sisters who are ministering across Japan, the similar vision to see your glory known and enjoyed. God, we pray that you would bless us with your presence as we think and wrestle with these things. Give us good conversations, courage to share. And we thank you for the opportunity. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So do you guys mind just introducing yourselves real quick? Maybe you can just share what's your name, what organization you're with, and what your role is, and how long you've been in Japan. Does that work? Chris, you want to start?
Okay, I'm Chris Payne with OMF. I've been in Japan since 2007, and I'm field director, so I lead our team in Japan.
Here, switching, Stephanie.
Okay. I'm Stephanie Schutz. I am with Pioneers in Japan, and I've been here since 2008. And my role is area leader, so it's somewhat similar to a field director, except that I'm not particularly responsible for deciding where everyone goes, but keeping our team leaders accountable to the ministries that they themselves are deciding they are doing.
And I'm Robert Adair with some combination of A3 Asian Access or SIM, depending where you're looking. And I lead the team here, been in Japan since 2005.
All right, thank you guys so much. Well, let's dive in. During your tenure, both as missionaries and as mission leaders, how have you seen the demographics of Japan change as it relates to an increase in foreign residents? What's your personal experience been like? Anyone can jump in. Go ahead, Chris.
So I guess I moved from Hokkaido down to Kanto 4 years ago, so that feels like a big change. Rather than to do with necessarily the change in demographic, but I think definitely in our area where I live right now, we're seeing way more people coming in for like labouring jobs and serving in the convenience stores and things like that. So we've definitely noticed an increase of foreigners around us as well, people in our area moving in. So yeah, we've definitely seen an increase.
So the first 2 years I lived in Hokkaido as well, and my impression during that time is there were noticeable foreigners that were living in the community that I lived in. But when I moved to Fukuoka, and I've been there for the last 14 years, initially it was very obvious that I was a minority, and we had a lot more Asian foreigners in our community. So just generally looking around, I would often feel like, oh, I'm the only one. But then as you would listen into conversations, you'd be like, nope, they're speaking Korean, they're speaking Chinese, they're speaking Vietnamese. And so I think like noticing like that there's a large Southeast Asian population is definitely grown in our area.
And similarly, the closest station to us is right by the port fisheries area. And just over the last few years, there's times I hop off the train and there's more foreigners than Japanese people getting off the train.
Yeah, that matches my experience as well. I remember as a new missionary going to a convenience store, and there were Japanese people working at the convenience store, and now that's not normally the case. So there certainly is a demographic shift that we've all been kind of experiencing. So the next question I have, again, for each of you is, within your mission, do you have any direct engagement with ministering to foreign residents? Like, are some of the churches that you're affiliated with doing that, or some of the missionaries that you lead doing that? What's already going on?
We don't. Hello, hello? We lost another one. I know, right, cool. We don't have direct intentional engagement, but we have a lot of passive secondary engagement. So several folks that as a part of ministry with a local church or congregation have met friends in the community and it's kind of grafted in an organic or natural way.
I would say generally we see a similar thing where it's been this unintentional but natural connections with other foreigners. We have a pretty broad spectrum of how the churches we're partnered with view this situation. There's some that deliberately see, oh, right, we have someone who's Vietnamese, someone who's Korean. Let's intentionally build that bridge to these communities. We've had other churches say, no, we actually want our English service to reach Japanese, so let's make sure that it reaches Japanese people. And we have another house church in Miyazaki where the team leader and his wife said, we want to reach Japanese people, but somehow they ended up meeting a ton of foreigners living in their area. And so they said, you know what, we'll just take whoever God brings us. We're going to learn songs in their language. We're going to try and incorporate that into our Japanese service as well.
Interesting. Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, so as IMF, we have planted some international churches in the past, but I think we're probably moving away from that more at the moment, just partly because of where our vision is to really try and plant indigenous churches. And also we see other people doing that role really well. So we're kind of moving away from that, but we have done it in the past. We are working with some Chinese churches to help them reach Japanese. So we have workers who are Chinese speaking and they're helping them reach the Japanese. That's a slightly different dynamic, like the already established churches who then finding second and third generation kids who are really more Japanese than Chinese. So that's another area we've kind of been involved. My own church plant, my Japanese pastor and his wife have a real heart for reaching out to internationals. So we actually have a Thai Moldovan couple in our church that they kind of reached out to. So they're thinking about this issue, and the pastor's wife recently took a Japanese teaching qualification with the thought of can they do more in the future. So that's just a kind of outside OMF, but what I see in my church plant that I'm part of. And then we've had a church plant, for instance, that we started, and then we got a lot of JET teachers join. It was wonderful because they're really enthusiastic Christians, but after a while it started to feel quite foreign, and the church they were trying to plant was supposed to be really reaching the Japanese. And so we kind of had to make some adjustments there. So that's some of our different experiences.
Thanks so much. All right, Chris, I'm going to pick on you for a second. So you made reference to kind of an increased focus, I know this historical as well, on planting indigenous churches. How would you define an indigenous church? Particularly, what are you contrasting that with?
Yeah, so I guess, it's part of our OMF kind of international vision that we look for indigenous biblical church movements. So we're looking that whatever we hand over is going to be led by Japanese and kind of contextualized to a Japanese context. And of course, globalized Japan, you could well have in certain parts of the country, churches which are appropriately international. So it's not that we're against that, but most of our areas where we're trying to go to unreached areas, kind of more outside the big cities, then that's less, although some rural areas, of course, there are a lot of foreigners, but overall, that's where we're kind of aiming. So,
yeah, that's great. Thanks. Robert, A3 is not doing direct missionary church planting, so you guys aren't doing direct church planting. Within the Japanese churches that you're kind of working with and partnering with, or is there kind of an increased interest or desire in ministering to foreign residents? Is that showing up?
It is, not where our people are right now, but recently I've had more conversations with Japanese pastors who are asking us if we can send somebody. I had one asking to help us meet a Chinese population in their area, another that had an interest in reaching out to a Filipino Filipino community in their area. And so we're at a spot where we're wrestling through, basically, is that a road we want to go down?
Yeah. Are you able to share kind of how you're thinking at this moment, or
I can share.
Or what are the factors you're wrestling with? Or
I can share what Robert thinks about this at this
that
moment.
works.
What
Your unofficial position, that's fine.
But I think the tensions I'm wrestling with is, so I had a Japanese friend challenge me years ago when I was talking about reaching Japanese people, and he was like, "You're not called just to reach Japanese people, but you're called to reach the people in Japan." And I think there's theologically, missiologically, I think God desires for all people in Japan to come to know him. There's also within our organization, I think we have some areas of competency or that God's called us to. And there's something in being faithful in that. And so how do we kind of navigate the tension between everything we could be doing, all the good things we could be doing, with the thing we're actually called to do. The other tension that I'm wrestling with is, and I think somebody touched on it earlier, is I've had folks on my team who have said either because of language, like it's easier to reach out to people in English than it is in Japanese, or for responsiveness. I had a conversation with one of our people that says basically people, they were interacting with folks, Chinese background people in Tokyo, they are responding to the gospel quicker than Japanese people are. Therefore, we need to put our energy into reaching out to these communities. And so how do we balance out aligning with what God's doing, responding to areas where there's response versus being faithful or understanding that in light of being faithful to what God has called us to as a mission and just trying to sort that out.
Yeah.
So there's no answer there. We're just trying to figure it out. Yeah.
That's good. That's good. Stephanie, where's Pioneers on all of this right now?
Just thinking about what is our response to the foreign population. Are actually not really been driven so much by what's been happening within Japan itself, but as pioneers globally. So we're not sent from one mobilization base. We have 17 offices around the world. And some of our fastest growing mobilization offices are Brazil and also in Africa, in Kenya and in Ghana. And so trying to think through, our organization is mobilizing Christians from all these different countries across the world. Are we equipped to receive them as co-workers alongside of us? And then what's that going to look like in Japan? And so obviously, I think they're going to attract different opportunities, especially if they're doing more tent-making ministries. Most of us are here on religious visas, so that will change the type of ministry we do. But I think just by the fact that we're welcoming other people from other countries to be part of our work will change the ministry, what it looks like for us too.
Hop in. Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe one other thing, just something that we try and talk about in OMF is the 6 ways of mission. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but talking about learning about mission, praying about mission, mobilizing for mission, sending in mission and going in mission. But then the 6th one is welcoming. So when we're thinking about when we plant churches and how do we plant churches which are going to be missional and eventually think about reaching out to their neighbors, but then also cross-culturally as well. Actually, that component of welcoming the foreigners here is something that we do want to see built into the churches that we're planting. So we have to model it at some level, but we're a bit shy of making it a commitment for our workers who've spent a lot of time learning Japanese and put a lot of effort into that.
Yeah. Now, you guys all are familiar with this conversation that's been happening from a number of Japanese Christian leaders about, giving more focus to ministry to foreigners. Was this surprising to anybody that this has come on the radar, or what were kind of your feelings or responses learning that this was a topic of discussion? So important that it got mentioned at JCE7 as one of the main topics to think about. Yeah, anybody can go first.
If I can be very frank, I did think, yes, it's about time we're having this conversation.
Okay.
I guess even though that nothing's been intentional in any of our churches and partnerships, when I first moved to Fukuoka, my closest friend were Chinese exchange students because that's who I met at my Japanese classes. And so it's been on my radar, how do I encourage them to come to church with me? Is there a safe place for them to come to church with me? And so I'm just really glad that churches are thinking who's in our neighborhood and how can we be reaching out and loving them.
Okay.
Yeah, I wasn't that surprised.
Yeah.
I mean, but just anecdotally, there'd been enough anecdotal conversations that I've been a part of that very happy to hear that it's happening at a national scale. It's an important conversation.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much the same. I thought it was really interesting to see at JC7, the international night for kind of its Christianity in Japan, which was a very different flavor from, what we saw the rest of the week. But that was really encouraging. And I think that we heard of it this morning, but that desire to embrace the kind of diversity and the complexity and all the wonderful kind of variety within God's kingdom is really healthy. And it's going to be a good thing overall.
One interesting nuance, over the weekend, I knew we were having this discussion, so I was asking a pastor I was with what he thought about the subject. And his take on it was that the Japanese church needs to be intentional in this area, and the missions community needs to stay focused on Japanese people.
Interesting. What do you think is motivating that?
I think the primary motivation, I think, is a historical image of what is a missionary.
Yeah.
But I think there's also elements of stewardship, capacity. Why spend all this money to have Robert come all the way to Japan and pay for me to be in Japan to reach people, especially in my case, those demographics are all represented in the States.
Uh-huh.
And so I think but I think it's predominantly coming from the historical image of the missionary.
Sure, sure.
One thing that I did think was maybe a note of caution, that when I hear it expressed from a missiological perspective, like this is our responsibility to reach out to these people alongside ourselves, that's great. Occasionally I've heard a pastor talk about this could be the solution for my dying church.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that's a bit more worrying, because I think that's probably not the right motive, and also probably people not going to be equipped to do it well.
Interesting. What makes you concerned about that?
So if you are only reaching to sustain yourself, that's kind of self-centered, and the gospel is different from that. And then also because I think it's going to involve a lot of change if we do it well. Like if you welcome people into your church, it should change you as well. And so to actually not be doing it so that we can sustain what's here, but thinking more, how do we change together? And then that will hopefully give birth to outreach to Japanese people in the area as well. I mean, it may already be happening, but just that difference in motive and desire, what the desire to do it is, I think is quite important.
So you said you had reservations about it. Your reservations right now sound like they're more about the specific ways that might go about as opposed to the general concept.
Yeah, like the church should definitely be doing this. I think
Okay.
that's really important. But yeah, what's motivating, what's driving it?
Yeah.
And if it's just to sustain what's there, then that's a different kind of motive that I'm not so sure about. And it's not common, but I have heard one or two people kind of getting excited. This is the solution for my church. Like if I can get a bunch of foreigners in, maybe my church won't die.
Yeah.
And that's
And-
tension there.
And in that, I'm familiar with some similar situations, but in that, do you think that's primarily thinking about they're going to bring finances, or they're just going to bring people, or what do you think is the draw or the attraction in that maybe not so positive way?
I mean, I guess both of those things, right?
Okay.
But yeah, I don't know. But
Yeah.
just that's conversations I've had. So yeah.
Interesting. One thing that's interesting, in my recent experience, we go to a Japanese church, small kind of traditional Japanese church, and it feels like a traditional Japanese church. And when I say that, I think everybody has like an image of what I mean by that, and it's kind of clear. And I think when you use the word indigenous, I think a lot of people, our minds would actually go to that indigenous meaning traditional. I know that's not what you mean, Chris, and feel free to hop in and try to clean me up on that. But in that traditional church, what's fascinating is that the demographic in this church over the last 10 years has become completely without planning, very international, to where maybe even like 1/3 of regular attenders are from are not from Japan. And yet it hasn't been like an intentional kind of effort that's been done. I think there are some pastors that are like that right now, that are basically kind of looking around and maybe even looking at us missionaries and going, what am I supposed to do? If a pastor were to ask you that, how would you all kind of respond, or how might you advise? Churches become international even though it wasn't necessarily an intention. Should I kick all these foreigners out of here, or what do I do? Anybody want to hop in?
What's the JEMA line on this one?
There is never a JEMA line.
I'm hesitant to say what any Japanese pastor should do.
Oh, that's really wise. But he's asking you for advice.
Right. No, yeah.
I mean, you're a missionary.
Yeah.
You know all about foreign residents.
Yeah.
How should I think about this? What should I do?
Yeah, and I think that's where it's learning. It's a learner's posture. It's praying. It's trying to figure out how to care for the people. It feels like such a case-by-case situation. So I think it's going back to questions, discernment, finding people that have maybe a few steps farther down the road with that journey of exploring what international church looks like. Humility and curiosity seem the key.
Yeah, I was just thinking of my own personal situation. So this isn't necessarily for all pioneers, but the situation I work in, we intended to plant a Japanese church with a Japanese pastor. But the very fact that I'm a noticeable foreigner attracted other people to come. Like if they're looking on the website, there's an assumption, hey, there's a white girl, they probably speak English. And so they'll just show up. So we did somewhat have to wrestle through so if we're setting about, having a Japanese church, how do you deal with this? And what we decided is we're going to continue to speak in Japanese. If people can't speak Japanese and they need translation, we'll provide that, but that's not going to be the way we run the church. We're going to still make that first. And I think what ended up happening is we've attracted a lot of Japanese speaking foreigners as well. And one of the nice things that ended up coming through that is there's actually quite a lot of foreigners who don't speak English. Like they are having to speak in Japanese as their second language too. And so I think just being able to say like we're gonna engage with these people, we're gonna meet them where they're at, but this is just gonna be an understanding, and that's just one of the decisions that churches have to make, like one of the logistics. But just still saying we can have a place in these people's lives, even if we have to make certain choices of how we'll run the church.
So in that setting, like the church is distinct from what we might call an international bilingual church. And we're going to have some pastors kind of helping us think through that this afternoon, which I'm looking forward to. But so that's distinct from kind of the international bilingual church.
Yeah.
And yet as a church that has a presence of a number of foreign residents.
Yes.
Like in that situation, are you trying to make their lives easier? Like, are there ways that you're sort of, leaning into that, or is it just kind of, we really can't do anything about it. We've accepted it as just part of the territory.
I guess like I'm not sure what you mean by making their lives easier. Like if they truly cannot speak Japanese, we do have someone who does like the radio translation. So it's not happening bilingual in front of everyone, but maybe on like behind the scenes it's happening bilingually. If people come and just in conversation in translation, I'm willing to pitch in and help with that as well. But I think all of them are part of one of our small groups. Like we don't have just like one special small group for all the foreigners. They're sprinkled throughout the congregation. And so there's like this real intentionality in trying to get them engaged with the full life of the church, not feel like second-class citizens.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting to me. And when I hear the Japanese church like kind of thinking about this, I think that's a very interesting direction. Because on the one hand, you have it's great if we can increase partnerships with, churches that have predominantly Nepalese or churches that have primarily Brazilians. But there is this dynamic that's happening where the Japanese church as we know it is becoming more international. And how do we have a, posture of hospitality and welcoming? It sounds like you guys are getting to try that out.
Just one last comment
Sure.
with that. I was sharing with my small group earlier. Unfortunately, for various reasons, I've had to do several hospital stays within Japan. And through that, I met a Christian doctor, and she said, "You're a great case study. You can help my doctors just know how to approach a foreigner because many of them are afraid, they don't know what to do." And it was really interesting to be part of that project, and they had done research and found that most foreigners actually know more simple Japanese than they do English. And so there's a lot of presuppositions by pastors of like, oh, in order to engage with this foreigner, I need to know English. But the research showed if you just speak simple Japanese, like you would to a child or to a younger person,
Or to me.
Or me, yeah. Like you're just going to have a far better communication situation if you go about that. And so I think the takeaway for me as well, like in churches, we can probably apply that same principle. Like we're foreigners, we can speak simple Japanese, like we don't have to retrain ourselves. So just having that awareness and teaching our pastors how to communicate with foreigners in simple Japanese can be really effective as well.
Oh yeah, sounds beautiful. Any thoughts on that, Chris?
No, you carry on.
Okay. When we think about indigenous versus international church and kind of the presence of foreign residents, Chris, part of your hesitation about this was you want to plant indigenous churches. Can indigenous churches be filled with lots of foreign residents?
Yeah, so I guess when we're talking about Indigenous, the initiative is with Japanese leadership, and definitely like the church that I'm in, Japanese pastors leading it with a heart to reach internationals. We're fully behind that within the church. I guess where we are organisationally as OMF is that we're trying to go into some of the more unreached areas. We see other people working really well in those spaces, so we'll go to places where it's probably more appropriate to be less international and more focused on a Japanese church that's going to welcome people who are not so comfortable with the international engagement. I think probably we've met people who are very comfortable with that sort of diversity. They find that welcoming, they find that easier to be in. That's great. But probably we're focused in a slightly different area. But that's where we are as an organisation, because we're thinking through where should our focus be, not kind of as a missiological conviction that that's right for everybody.
Sure.
So I think, like my pastor it's a really interesting guy. He did his missiology in the States. As a missiological kind of contextualization, he deliberately has English in the worship songs because he's like, that's what all the young people are listening to. And so he's like, and so he sees that that kind of international flavor is an important part of planting a church in the urban context that we're in.
Very interesting. So again, along these lines of kind of the indigenous church and international church, these kind of concepts that we're, working with more and more. Question for any of you guys: can a missionary plant an indigenous church?
Yes.
Anyone want to weigh in?
What are you asking?
Okay. So,
I mean, yes would be a simple answer, but
Yes.
what's the question behind your question?
well, in thinking about ministry to foreign residents, I think it's really common for missionaries to want to have a focus primarily on reaching Japanese. I think that's present in some of the OMS kind of thinking right now. I think it makes a lot of sense. It's my own natural thinking. However, if you're in a church planting situation where the missionary is the one who's doing the church planting, is the kind of primary pastor, is that church not kind of essentially at the very beginning an international church in the fact that you have an international pastor?
So we don't have an official policy. Oops.
Yeah.
We don't have an official policy within Pioneers, but generally our teams have chosen to partner with Japanese pastors
Okay.
from the beginning, just because of that awareness of
Interesting.
like we ourselves will have to go through different forms of thinking or efforts what would come very naturally for them. And so our stance has been, how do we empower leaders when we can, and if we can't, how do we just invite their voices into what's happening in decision making?
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we do have some OMF-led church plants, but we're also trying to increase our partnerships in church planting. So we're working alongside or under Japanese leadership because of the tensions there. But also, I think even if where you're thinking about where your church goes, that can change some decisions you make. Like, how am I going to focus on the leadership structure? What languages are we going to allow or encourage for fellowship or not? How is the church going to be organized? What other church relationships are we going to build? Are we going to build with others that are more international or others that are more, stronger Japanese connections? So, of course, the fact that you're a foreigner affects the church, but equally the choices you make kind of set some things around the trajectory and where this church is going to kind of find its landing place eventually. So I think that's where the difference comes in.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think two other examples I think of is we've partnered and worked with churches that one where it was a gentleman who was, a U.S. citizen, I think, but he'd grown up in Japan. He was kind of a TCK type who was leading a church, and another working with a Korean pastor who was kind of in the mix of Korean Japanese culture. And I think those were, I think they fall within it. And
Indigenous church.
indigenous, yeah. I'm hesitant to get to cut things too thinly.
Sure.
Define it too tightly. Like, we're for the church. We want to see people in Japan reached.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks for entertaining a difficult question there. And part of what leads me to ask that, I'll share this and then we'll move into Q&A time. I've got mutual friends that I've been working on church planting together, and the missionary is the primary church planter and has a Japanese guy that is a seminary student, so he's not planning to be there long term, but has been joining in and assisting. And for the missionary, the desire was really to have like a Japanese church, and that's been the vision. It's a very good vision, very well thought out. And yet the person kind of pushing for them to consider using bilingual services or to embrace their international identity is actually the Japanese team member. And his rationale is, this is like the primary thing you guys bring to the table is your foreignness. And it's the thing you seem kind of most keen to want to kind of cover up and hide. And it's led to really good conversations with their team, like kind of wrestling with what does all of this mean. But that's one of the things I love about this topic is that it just kind of highlights the complexities of the current situation that we're in. It's probably a little bit different than it was 20, 30 years ago. Well, thank you guys so much. And I'm going to keep you on the spot, and we're going to open up the floor for others to ask questions. I'm going to grab a mic stand so we can do this well. If you'd like to come ask a question, we're going to do this for several minutes. You're welcome to come up to the front and ask a question. You can direct towards one panelist or do it open-ended.
Stephanie says she wants all of our ones.
So in the discussion of international and indigenous churches, it seems like we're talking about this in relation to, say, the nationality or ethnicity of the people involved. Would you say that, what do you see the relationship between that question, what makes an indigenous versus international? It seems to me that a big part of that is, for lack of a better term, is the church internally self-sustaining, that is not, dependent on foreign support. How do you see that relating, one, to the definition, and then two, about the strategic nature of being indigenous or international? Does that question, kind of two-part question, make sense? I'll break it. Sorry, I shouldn't have done a two-part question. Number one, when we talk about indigenous versus international, where does the concept of how is the church sustained come into that delineation, and what should we be prioritizing in that?
My knee-jerk reaction to that question that I may not agree with in 15 minutes is that in being indigenous, there's something about being pleasing or fitting local sensibilities and being sustainable within local sensibilities. And I think about, when I think international and I think outside of the major cities, I think it's difficult to have a church that's sustainable with international sensibilities. And so I think that sustainability piece is a big piece of what it means. Chris, you you're ready to go.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking some similar things, because I think, as we've sort of talked a bit, you could have a contextualized church, indigenous, like led by Japanese people, intensely international, and that would be absolutely great. That's fine, but it's going, and that's going to hit a particular part of Japanese society. But if you're in a different area, you're going to need a different approach, and so maybe that international indigenous isn't, we use it as kind of a helpful shorthand, but there's times when that breaks down, because actually an international church could well be indigenous. So it's, but what I think we're looking for is, where's the decision-making power, where's the theologizing and the self-sustaining, but also like governance and all those things coming from. And so, and then in terms of where it goes next, in terms of reproduction. So where in a city, obviously you could plant potentially international churches, but in some of the other areas that may be less of a sustainable solution for sort of long-term health and growth. So it's how you work those things out. And again, in the big cities, I think probably there's a greater level of sort of longer-term residence, whereas my picking up of what happens in the rural areas, you do have a lot of people coming through, but they're on quite short-term visas. And they're also limited sometimes in their freedom. We were picking us up in our group earlier, a couple of people sharing, like, they've done some outreach to people who are in for fisheries or agriculture, and then they've come to one event, and then their boss has kind of shut them down and said, no, you can't do that. You can't go to that place and be part of that social group. So that changes what maybe you think about the church and how it's sustainable long term, although the church still has a duty to reach those people. So it's just whether that's the missionaries' primary focus, I would say.
Hearing your question, my thoughts kind of went a little bit rabbit trailing, but another thing I thought of is, by being indigenous or being international, who are we hoping to welcome in through the doors? And I feel like I hear a split conversation of certain pastors advocating, if you're foreign or international, that's a great calling card. People are interested, so they'll just come because you look different. On the other hand, I've also heard pastors say, if we have too much foreignness, people will feel uncomfortable and Japanese people won't come. And so I've heard both very different opinions being voiced by Japanese pastors at the same time. And I think likely, especially if we're talking about non-Christians, they're not going to be attracted to the exact same model. And so even apart from finance and support and everything, I think part of the conversation is, who do we hope to be able to reach? And if it's different, we're actually probably doing better because we have different people who are going to come to either of those options.
And I think another area kind of that actually it might be helpful to parse this out that I've been reflecting on is, I think there may be three categories. There's kind of the indigenous category. There's three categories in my mind, and this needs to be reformed. But there's there's the Japanese, there's the international engaged in the English world, and then there's the international engaged in the non-English world. And I think that in my reactions to questions and ideas in this area, I have a much more open-handed, curious approach to the English world than I do about the non-English world. And I don't want you guys to think like, yeah, but I just like there's a different approach and response that I see in myself that I feel like I need to reflect on, and that I think I perceive in the churches and people around me.
One more question? Anyone?
I think one of the things that I'm hearing as well is uh, missionaries who look different. How are you guys dealing in your organizations with missionaries that don't look different, and how are they engaging with this ministering to internationals versus Japanese and that type of thing? You could comment on that.
Yeah. So I'm the area leader, and underneath me are our team leaders, and they're the ones who are on the ground doing church planting. And every single one of our team leaders is either Asian American or they're Caucasians married to Japanese. And so for at least one of those spouses, they're constantly invisible as being different to the rest of society here. And that's been interesting to think through because for many of them, like being here also has that identity issue. Who am I? Especially if I'm an invisible minority. And so I think each person responds to that. And I'm going to say they also respond to it differently depending on how long they've been in Japan. For some people, obviously, it can be comforting not to be noticed so much. For others, it's frustrating because there's a lot of expectations that are being thrown at them. But they're like, I just arrived in Japan. I shouldn't have to be expected to know Japanese immediately. So I shouldn't speak too loudly because I do have another Pioneers worker here with us, so you can pick their brain as well. But I think even if we can't totally identify with people, we want to have the posture of empathy. Like maybe I don't understand entirely what you have to go through, but I'm going to trust that there's difficult elements of that as well, even if there's also really positive things with it. So just giving an opportunity and space for people to share their stories and let them talk about what they're going through.
So yeah, it's a really good question. I think about some of our Chinese background country sort of church planters and team members. The cultural gap looks very different, but it's sometimes easier to bridge, and I can think of maybe a particular situation where somebody's gone in just their basic cultural understanding of how the church functions with a kind of more hierarchical leadership and what their role within that structure is just instinctively much stronger than a Western missionary who's gone in very similar timing and is really struggling with it. So, but I think also then and then the networks that they bring in terms of how they're already connected into some of these international communities that are non-English speaking, but Chinese speaking, Korean speaking, and the richness that brings to their experience, their understanding, and then the relationships they can pull into their work and is also very different. I think this is a slightly off topic, but I'm just as an organization, we're wrestling as well with being increasingly multicultural and how do we live that out better, and I think one of the concepts I've come across that's been challenging me recently is this idea that there's a cultural humility that comes from the gospel, that when we talk about like Ephesians and breaking down the dividing wall, and that our understanding of our sinfulness also should then lead to a cultural humility which says, well, my cultural understanding is also flawed and sinful. And so I need to come with curiosity, I need to come with humility, the kind of things that Stephanie was talking about, but that's driven by the gospel, and that gives us hope. And I guess that's something which I think really needs to come into this discussion, because when we clash, it's actually maybe that's pointing to something in our lack of Christ-likeness, and not just a cultural issue, but actually that the gospel does something to culture, and that we need to think about that.